Hey, this is Language Shrimp. Today we're talking about agreement. First we'll discuss what agreement is, how it happens, etc. Then we'll talk about what different grammatical systems can agree on, and which grammatical systems can contain agreement in the first place. So, agreement, also called concord, is when a word changes form depending on the details of another word it relates to. English has it in a very, very limited capacity. Think about the difference between I work and she works, where both are describing that someone does work, but they still have slightly different forms depending on the subject. Our specific brand of agreement here is based on person and number, and is again very limited, as outside of the copula, we mostly just have that yes or no to the extra S distinction. And I'll get more into what that means in a bit. Agreement is notably extremely common, with the majority of languages actually containing its most common form, verb agreement, to some capacity. Nearly 80% of languages according to WALs. So, you will more than likely want to consider including it in your language. Agreement is the main tool of head-marking languages, one of three big ways to indicate semantic and syntactic role, along with case for dependent marking languages and word order for zero-marking languages, both of which I've gone into in other videos. Agreement does this in a very unique way. While in case systems, different arguments have their role marked directly on them, and in strict word order systems, role is indicated by arguments being put in specific syntactic slots, with particles to indicate more unique roles. In agreement systems, one argument is marked in a way that you can see which other argument in the phrase it connects to, and then you can automatically tell the role of that argument by how the agreement works. Let's just look at an example. Let's take the dog chased the cat. Because us English speakers use word order, we immediately recognize that the dog is the subject and agent, performing the chasing upon the object or patient, the cat. But what if we added the most common form of agreement, subject-verb agreement? Let's not get into details of how right now, and just say that on the verb chased, we put some sort of marker that clarifies that the subject of the sentence is the dog. The dog chased, dog is subject, the cat. Now we can shift things around. We could say the cat chased, dog is subject, the dog, and still know that the dog is doing the chasing, because we just have to look at the verb to see that. However, from here comes the first big limit to agreement. Languages don't just put, oh, by the way, this is the subject, in parentheses. They are all marked by different marking indicating attributes of the subject, and you must tell from context what it agrees with. For the dog, you could do its number, singular, there's only one dog, its person, third, it's not you or I, and if your language has a complex noun system, maybe even some sort of a broad category like animal. However, if we categorize our other argument, the cat, we'll notice it's a very similar set of data. The cat is also a singular third-person animal. Of course, you could find some sort of difference to make between them. Like maybe if your language has a very abstract noun class system, like gender, then the dog might be masculine and the cat feminine. But my point is there will always be overlap in your categories, and quite often a lot of overlap, meaning you will always need more than just agreement to indicate semantic and syntactic role. As for how agreement happens, if case is the glomming on of adpositions to everything, then agreement is the glomming on of pronouns to everything. Essentially, the way it supposedly starts out is in a situation where there is one noun and something else, usually considered the head. Remember, agreement is also known as head marking. The pronoun form of the noun gets used so much that eventually it affixes to the head. And then this marked version of the head starts getting used alongside nouns that would use the corresponding pronoun. This process is actually happening in some dialects of French right now. French used to have a different agreement system, inherited all the way back from Proto-Indo-European. But that system has been decayed by sound changes to the point where different conjugations are rarely actually pronounced differently. So now it started criticizing pronouns of the verb in the way I just described above, and using these newly marked forms alongside non-pronouns. Because of the fact agreement is generally the affixing of pronouns, most time pronouns themselves become unnecessary in parts of the language that use agreement instead, to the point that they become pro-drop languages. These languages may even begin to forget their pronouns if they are rendered unnecessary through the bulk of the language, causing them to need to redevelop them if the language loses its agreement. Okay, now onto listing. In terms of categories that are the basis of agreement, grammatical person is the most important by far, and in fact, universal. Another alternate name for agreement, or at least a term you'll see used in its place, is person marking, because person is the root from which other agreement types derive. I tend to not use this term because agreement, of course, includes more than just person, but person is certainly a necessary part of agreement. This makes sense because, as mentioned, agreement derives from pronouns, and the person distinction is really what gives pronouns as a class their purpose. Notably, weirder person distinctions other than the basic first, second, third can also show up in agreement, such as the inclusive-exclusive distinction in the first person and the proximate-obviate distinction in the third, like in Hishkayana or Ojibwe, respectively, or even things like indefinite, reflexive, or reciprocal pronouns, like in Navajo. Most of these distinctions I go into in my parts of speech video. Next, following along with the correspondence between agreement and pronoun components, we have grammatical number, the most common secondary semantic feature to appear on nouns, and thus pronouns. Number-based agreement can occur with all the weird number systems I mentioned in other videos. And similarly to how you almost always have number distinctions to some extent in pronouns and nouns, you almost always get number distinctions in agreement. Now onto more variable stuff. Perhaps the biggest tool to making a complex agreement system, where different third-person arguments can be consistently distinguished, is by having a noun class or gender-based agreement system. Similar to person and number, I go over this concept in my basic syntax video. But to recap, some languages categorize their nouns into different classifications based on various criteria, mainly animacy, or how alive something is, but also the likes of respect or uniqueness, shape, or abstract gender distinctions like masculine and feminine. The go-to examples for languages that go crazy with this are Navajo and Swahili, both having over a dozen classes which they then use to make complex agreement systems. Swahili does this intuitively with its 18-ish classes based on animacy, shape, and number, by marking nouns with their class, then giving related markings to the things those nouns agree with. Meanwhile, Navajo gets weird. It sort of has two different noun class systems, neither of which are marked on the nouns themselves. It distinguishes 11 shaped-based classes, which are marked on the verb based on the direct object of the sentence. These affixes are so deeply and weirdly fused into the stem that sometimes it's said that instead of different conjugations of these verbs are entirely different words, and you instead base the verb you use on the class of its object. For example, there are sometimes said to be 11 different Navajo words for to give, based on these 11 classes. Meanwhile, it also has an 8-way distinction in animacy, which does not have any sort of corresponding affixes, instead determining word order as per Navajo's hierarchical alignment, which I go into in my morphosyntactic alignment video. Then we have a bit of an oddball, case agreement, which notably doesn't really make sense a lot of times, as agreement and case are both methods of indicating semantic and syntactic role. Case straight up can't be the basis of agreement for verbs and adpositions. If the pronouns had some sort of case marking when they were affixed, then there may be artifacts of this, like if a language had an accusative form for its pronouns, and then developed a verb-object agreement, then the accusative form would be what would be affixed on, but this wouldn't give you any new information. And if adpositions and case marking were working in conjunction to form subtle meanings, then when the pronoun with the case marking attaches to the adposition, it's effectively just deriving a new adposition with that subtle meaning. With things like adjectives and determiners, though, one might have more success. Notably, this kind of agreement within the noun phrase can eventually lead to indication, where somehow case marking gets lost on the noun itself, but then the adjective and determiner hold on to it. This question of whether case is marked directly on the noun, on a modifier, or on both is known as the language's case concord. This concord idea within noun phrases can extend beyond case, though, to things like definiteness, number, noun class, and distance, all of which can theoretically be marked with distinct determiners, marked on the adjective, marked on the noun, or marked on both, leading technically to agreement. Definiteness agreement is notable for usually only occurring in these noun phrase concord situations, likely due to pronouns not really making definiteness distinctions. Even the indefinite person, when used in agreement, usually won't agree with indefinite nouns, because they are different concepts. There are exceptions, though. Hungarian notably has a unique definiteness agreement system with its verbs and objects, but also having a more standard person-based systems with its verbs and subjects, with the verb being marked with the person of the subject but the definiteness of the object, which I would call simple indication if it weren't for the fact Hungarian also has definiteness specifying articles, leading to the redundancy that constitutes agreement. Finally, the weirdest one, alliterative agreement, when phonological parts of one word are marked on another to show agreement without necessarily caring about grammatical category. This is found in Bainuk, Landuma, and supposedly some Kru and Arapesh languages. But don't get me wrong, this system is absurdly rare, and it makes sense as to why, as it throws out the rules of agreement completely. Firstly, and the obvious part it's named after, it takes sounds from one word wholesale and puts them on the other, when almost all other morphology comes from particles becoming affixes. But also, in Bainuk's variant specifically, nouns actually agree with their heads instead of vice versa, being marked by phonological parts of determiners and verbs and the like, which sort of turns it back into a form of dependent marking. And that's all for major things languages can agree on. It's actually not that extensive relative to some other systems. But let's get on to situations agreement can be used in. First and most importantly, verb agreement, where the verb is marked to correspond with its subject and or object. There's mainly just subject-verb agreement, where the verb agrees with its subject, and polypersonal agreement, which is the only major example of a head agreeing with more than one dependent. Now, WALs doesn't differentiate between subject or object in terms of agreement, just agent and patient. But from what I've seen, whenever the patient is the only argument marked to agree with the verb, it's often due to weird ergativity stuff. Unlike case, these agreement markers don't seem to have a strong tendency towards being suffixes at the end of a word, as opposed to prefixes before it, although WALs doesn't list that data. From what I've seen, the language's agreement markers pretty straightforwardly mirror word order, with SVO languages going subject marker, verb stem, object marker, and SOV languages going subject marker, object marker, or maybe fused subject-object marker and verb stem. There's one major exception to this, though. In the Indo-European languages, despite being SOV back in Proto-Indo-European days, they have subject agreement at the end of the verb and no object agreement, perhaps being due to subject pronouns getting moved around in weird ways. Now onto a related but rarer thing, applicatives, found in languages like Swahili and Ainu. Applicatives are technically a variety of grammatical voices that promote an adpositional phrase or oblique to the direct object of a phrase, similar to how the passive voice promotes a direct object to a subject. However, many languages can use this as a basis of allowing the verb to essentially agree with obliques. Some languages, when doing this promotion, oust the original object, thus only allowing the intransitive verbs to take applicatives, while others allow transitive verbs to take applicatives, making a distinguishment between the applied object and base object, very much mirroring the difference between an indirect and direct object. Most languages with applicatives, though, allow them to be used with both intransitive and transitive phrases. There can also be multiple types of applicatives, roughly corresponding to some of the core case types, namely the benefactive, instrumental, and locative applicatives. Notably, a language will usually only have 1 to 3 applicative types, though, often leaving the original adpositional meaning of the promoted object somewhat up to context to determine. Unsurprisingly, the marker of applicatives likely just comes from adpositions affixing to the verb, likely along with the corresponding pronouns, due to the strong association with agreement, or through a unique agreement position for the applied object versus the base object, which, if you are doing benefactive only, you may have noticed means that the applicative is literally just another name for agreeing with the indirect object. Next, we have adjectives and determiners agreeing with the nouns they modify, which you may think is weird because adjectives and determiners are usually considered more dependent-like, but it most certainly happens. Both of these categories, adjectives especially, have some head-like behavior. But more simply, natural language doesn't really care about our categorization of things. If the shoe fits, it goes on. And with adjectives and determiners' whole thing being sitting next to nouns and pronouns, it's not surprising that they start agreeing with stuff. Sadly, WALs doesn't have data on how often this agreement occurs, but it seems to occur in ways you'd expect based on the same criteria. I've also mentioned how adjectives and determiners might agree with more types of things than other systems, with different types of noun phrase concord, like with case and definiteness. Then we have possessive affixes. I mentioned the genitive construction and some of its types in my case video. There are 2 main root ways to show this relation: a genitive connector or adposition, and possessive pronouns. These 2 root ways can then be used to develop the genitive case in case systems, and possessive affixes or possessive agreement in agreement systems. I already went over the genitive case in my case video, but essentially with possessive pronouns, the possessed argument in the phrase has a pronoun attached corresponding to the possessor, kind of like saying the man his tie instead of the man's tie or the tie of the man. This possessive pronoun can then affix onto the possessed head, and boom, possession expressed through agreement. Notably, the genitive adposition and case usually have much broader general relation meaning beyond just possession, while these possessive pronouns and possessive affixes usually specifically handle possession, and thus many languages apply both of these strategies. Similar to agreement on the verb, this phenomena of possessive affixes is actually found in the majority of languages, about 70% of them. The reason you likely never heard of them, though, might be because this is extremely rare in Indo-European languages in particular. And lastly, we have inflected adpositions, which, you guessed it, is adpositions agreeing with their objects. These are interesting because true adpositional agreement is actually relatively rare compared to certain other types, but you see something very similar to it a fair bit more often: adpositional pronouns. This starts out very similarly to other forms of agreement, with pronouns affixing onto adpositions. But for some reason, unlike other word classes, adpositions don't like going to the next step of using these inflected forms for agreement. Instead, they typically just keep the inflected form as only being able to indicate where a pronoun used to be. They don't always do this, though. There are a fair number of languages that use inflected adpositions both pronominally and to agree with full nouns. But it's not as automatic with adpositions as with other classes. And that should be all for this video. Thanks for watching.